So let's talk a little bit about instinct today. When I was, first aware of instinct in a way that, it fits into a larger picture as I'm viewing it today, I really didn't give it much thought. And you know why? Because instinct isn't about thought. Instinct, of course, happens outside of thought. When we bring thinking into it, as we know, we sort of cloud the instinct into a process we think of as intuition. And one thing I definitely discovered about myself, and I think we all discover about ourselves, is that when we are in our instinct, we realize that there's something more to us than just our intuition. For me, one of my big initial instinct stories, one that I mentioned in the book, in the Reconnection, is when my grandfather had given me a box of broken watches that he had taken to watch repair shop after watch repair shop until he gave up. Everyone said there was nothing they could do to fix it. He'd buy a new watch, he'd wear that until it would break, and watch repair after watch repair. Nothing that they could do with it. It would go into the box. And one day I was, 8, 9, 10, 11 years old, I would guess. And he presented me with this big old-fashioned cigar box filled with all these broken watches. So I looked at the first watch, I took it out of the box, I placed it in the palm of my hand, I placed my other hand over it, and I just held my hand there. When I removed my hand, the watch was ticking. I set it, I wound it, it worked perfectly. So of course, I went to the next watch. I would shake them, I would wind them, nothing would happen. I would place them in between my palms, I'd hold them there for a few moments, let go, and the watch would start to work. This was far outside of intuition. Intuition would have me thinking about it, wondering about it. My intuition might be telling me to place my hands over it, and maybe if I do, my intuition tells me that the watch might start. I didn't even think about that. I knew. Place the watch here, no thought, no thinking, just feeling, sort of listening, letting go, and the watch would work. And it was a lot of fun. I got all the watches working. My friends would bring me their parents and grandparents' broken watches, and I'd hold the watch and their watches would start to work again. It was really great. Now, funny how we think of instinct. If we look at definitions, often the definitions of instinct tell us that it's about survival. Of course we have survival instincts. We're born with an instinct to avoid high places. We're born with an instinct, I would assume, to avoid a lunging, hungry tiger. We're born with certain instincts that do work in the manner of survival. But is that all that instinct is? Are we created with instinct rooted within us, like love is rooted inside of us, to allow us not just to stay alive, but to prosper and be abundant in the love we experience and the life we experience, to maybe grow, to maybe evolve? In other words, is instinct, let's say, more of a benefit than we've allowed ourselves to consider? I remember when the first voice came channeling through one of my patients. And how did that happen? Well, I'll tell you. I adjusted my patient, finished with him on his back, with the chiropractic adjustment, had him close his eyes, and for some reason moved my hand over his face in a certain way. Don't know why. Didn't think about it. I didn't have my intuition telling me. I wasn't evaluating it. I just knew. It happened before I thought. And the muscles in the face began to move, and the mouth opened, and the voice came out. And there are many times, if you think about it, how often have you acted truly instinctually? If you're driving a car and there's someone else next to you and you're about to slam onto the brakes, do you think about your intuition, wondering whether you should reach your arm out in front of the other person and hold them back so they don't fly forward? Or does your arm just go out automatically? It just does. It's instinct. When I was asked about the DNA for the very first time and how many strands we had, I knew, logically. We have 2 strands of DNA. I learned that. I studied that. I'm a doctor. I know it. That was my thought process. And if I would have used my intuition, I would have gone 2 strands of DNA. But my mouth moved and said something that I had never heard, never thought of, was not in my intuition. My mouth said, I have 3. There are 12 strands of DNA, 12. When does instinct show up in our lives? And how? Does it show up when we are drawn to help someone else? Does it show up when we find ourselves looking for our own expansion? And when and how? Do we tend to interfere with or even block our own instinct? What causes that? Well, it's funny. A lot of us are drawn to intuition. What draws us to intuition? Well, we get a lot of accolades for intuition. It sort of feeds us. Oh, you had such a great intuition about that. I had such a wonderful intuition about this other thing. I'm glad I acted on it. These are interesting concepts, because if we allow ourselves to really look into it, the concept of intuition sort of plays on ego. It feeds our ego. Now, what keeps us in intuition is what prevents us from looking into this aspect of intuition. The ego doesn't really like to be explored. It doesn't really like to be exposed. Sometimes when we say, our ego brings us into this area instead of that area, we stop looking. The ego sort of stops us from looking. It's really hard to discuss the ego without the ego coming up to defend itself. Have you noticed that? We can logically look at ego in ourselves, and maybe if no one else is looking, we can explore it a little bit. But what happens when someone else says, let's look at this aspect of you? Could there be ego in it? The ego goes, nope, I'm not here. Go knock on another door. Go look somewhere else. But meanwhile, feed me. The ego says, feed me. My intuition, if it tells me this, if it tells me that, even the words have me sort of rise up. Yes, I had a great intuition. It led me here. It led me there. There's lots of accolade. There's lots of feeding of the ego. And also what comes about from it is thinking. My ego is saying this. My intuition is saying this. Is my intuition right? Shall I do this? Shall I do that? What is my intuition really telling me? See this discussion that I'm having with myself right here? Wondering what the ego is actually saying? This is me in thought. When my grandfather gave me that box of watches, I opened the watches, shook one, wound it, didn't wind, didn't start to tick, placed my hands over it, didn't think, should I place my hands over it? Should my hands be parallel to the ground? Should they be straight up and down? Should they be at an angle? How hard should I press or not press? Place my hands over it outside of thinking. I felt, I listened, I became one with, I shared, I explored, I removed my hands, and in my knowingness, from that instinctual interaction, the watch resumed being a watch and ticking. Watch after watch after watch. So, shall we watch for when we are in intuition and thought and sort of observing a slightly hungry, natural, hungry ego, and or what about when we become who we are? Love, beingness, instinct. You are instinct. Let's enjoy that.